In this video, I'm mainly going to be responding to William Lane Craig. But first, here's Bart Ehrman explaining why he rejects the resurrection.
Why don't I think a person got raised from the dead?
Yes.
Oh.
Why don't you think Jesus got raised from the dead?
I don't think anybody
Not
gets raised from
anybody.
the dead.
Okay.
Because it violates the laws of nature.
Okay.
I mean,
so you have the kind of a materialist, fundamentalist view.
well, let me ask this. You think God raised Jesus from the dead,
yeah.
right? Do you think God can break the laws of mathematics? Can God
can't contradict himself, no.
No,
Because
right.
he is...
Exactly.
Mathematics is his language.
That's right. The other language he uses is physics. Can he break the laws of physics?
I mean, I think we're getting off.
No, we are not. Because this is precisely. You asked me why I don't believe it.
Well-
and the reason I don't believe it is because it violates the laws of physics. And I don't
he
think
can
God.
feed things into his system, for sure.
I don't think God can break the law of physics any more than he can break the law of mathematics.
Feeding things into his system to bring a dead person to life is not the same thing as making 2 + 2 5. That's completely different things.
They are both laws that have never been broken in history.
Now, before I begin, I have to say that I'm extremely sympathetic towards arguments against miracles. I think David Hume was correct in broad strokes, even if there is debate over how to interpret him. And if you don't know who David Hume is, he's the guy most famous for saying, quote, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish." Unquote. Putting Hume aside, we can evaluate what Ehrman says on his own terms without trying to tie his views directly to a historical figure. That being said, I have two major problems with how he tries to frame the issues. First, talking like this gives the impression that you think miracles are impossible in principle, and opens you up to the charge of making a circular argument, even if that's not what you're trying to do. In other places, Ehrman seems to admit that he doesn't believe miracles are impossible, which is why this is confusing. I think a much better approach for an objector to take is to say, look, we have extremely well-supported generalizations about how nature operates that are in accord with my uniform experience of the world. And you're asking me to throw that out the window in this case because some ancient texts say so? Second, even if we do want to talk in terms of laws of nature, I think it's a mistake to equate, say, physics with mathematics in conversations about God. However theists are going to understand things like math and logic, they are almost certainly going to conceptualize them differently than they do physics. So it's just not going to be a productive comparison, even if you think it makes sense. But now on to Craig's response to Ehrman.
Yeah, this is so bad, Kevin. It shows that Bart Ehrman hasn't learned a thing in over 20 years. He is still offering that same warmed over version of Hume's argument against the identifiability of a miracle. And while as a New Testament scholar, he might have an excuse for not being familiar with these sorts of philosophical arguments, Ehrman has no excuse in this case because these things have been explained to him and he is ignoring them, and he is evincing a kind of invincible ignorance with regard to these issues. And here, he fails to reckon with the fact that one must not only consider the intrinsic probability of the event, say the probability of the event given the laws of nature. That's all Bart, following David Hume, considers. But what he doesn't consider is that other factor in the probability calculus, namely, what is the probability of the evidence given the resurrection of Jesus compared to the probability of the evidence given no resurrection of Jesus? What that means in practical terms, what is the probability of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the origin of the Christian faith, given the resurrection, compared to the probability of those facts, given that Jesus did not rise from the dead? Well, I think that clearly the evidence is far, far more probable given the resurrection hypothesis. And that can serve to outbalance any improbability that you see in the event of the resurrection itself. And he's only lately come over then to try to do historical Jesus research. And when he does that, as we've just seen, it is driven by this naturalistic philosophy that precludes a priori miracles based upon this obsolete and demonstrably incorrect argument of David Hume.
All right. I know I'm just a normal guy, but I'm here to help. First, it's just a myth that philosophers are in agreement that Hume has been debunked. Sure, if you interpret him as making a circular argument, or assume he's using a straight rule of induction, then the argument's dead in the water. But why assume that? Here are some examples of philosophers defending Hume. I'll just leave those on screen for a minute. Second, I understand that if we're weighing the probability of specific miracles, there are more things to consider. But I think it's trivially easy to charitably reconstruct Hume's views on miracles in general and put them in a Bayesian framework that accounts for both the prior probability and likelihood ratio. If we do that, I think Hume can be seen as making two major claims. First, the prior probability of miracles should be seen as so low that, as a general rule, you shouldn't believe they occurred based on testimony alone. Why? Because the kind of testimonial evidence we would need to overcome the low prior would have to be incredible. And nothing we have for specific miracles now has any hope of boosting the posterior probability to a respectable level. Now, of course, there's an argument to be had as to whether we should set the prior that low. But surely it's justified in some cases, right? Of course not! That's just warmed over Hume. Don't be deceived, beloved, for unto us an author has come. John Earman, a hero born to banish Hume's spirit to the depths of hell, to protect us from the skeptical attacks of the evil one, to deliver us. I have to let him out every now and then, right? Let's now consult John Earman, the critically acclaimed author who allegedly destroyed Hume once and for all on this topic. Quote, even if a worldwide opinion poll found hundreds of millions of witnesses to alien abductions, I would still not become a believer. I am not completely intransigent on this matter. I would, for instance, be swayed by hard physical evidence, such as pieces from a flying saucer. Unquote. Clearly I'm being a bit facetious, but to clarify my intention with sharing this quote, I am not implying that Earman doesn't disagree with his reading of Hume. It just seems like there are a lot of people who haven't read Hume's Abject Failure who think it destroys any kind of reasoning that could roughly be categorized as Humean. It does not. This quote is from the chapter What is Right About Hume's Position, where he admits multiple times that he thinks he's rightfully incredibly skeptical about alien abduction stories, and would basically need more than just people's say-so to become a believer. He distinguishes himself from Hume by claiming Hume is the kind of person who would be averse to updating their beliefs on these topics in any circumstance, whereas he is not. Though again, it appears that he would need multiple lines of evidence to think alien abduction stories have anything going for them, not just testimony. Anyway, let me help you visualize how a low prior probability can make a hypothesis with seemingly good evidence for it improbable. And bear with me, I'm going to tie this to miracles in a second. Let's start with a basic example. You live in a town where 80% of gray squirrels eat peanuts, and 30% of red squirrels eat peanuts. And I'm shamelessly choosing this example so I can show you clips of Phil, my son who I love. Look at that precious baby boy. Wow. Anyway, the squirrel demographics of the town are split 50-50 between gray and red squirrels. If a friend came up to you and said, I just saw a squirrel eating a peanut, what would the probability be that it was a gray squirrel? Now, we could actually calculate the probability using Bayes' theorem, but I want you to visualize it. Look at this chart and think about the probability space as the surface area of this entire square. The x-axis represents the prior probability, in this case the squirrel demographics, which are 50-50. The y-axis represents the expectedness of the evidence given the competing hypotheses. So as you can see, that you would observe a squirrel eating a peanut would be more expected on the gray squirrel hypothesis than the red squirrel hypothesis. And given that the demographics are evenly split, the gray block takes up more of the probability space. So the squirrel your friend saw eating the peanut was probably a gray squirrel. But look what happens when we change the prior probability. And in this case, the demographics of gray squirrels to 6%. Even though the observation of a squirrel eating a peanut is very likely if it's a gray squirrel, it no longer takes up nearly as much of the probability space, because there are just a lot more red squirrels, and 30% of a larger number is doing more work. Now, before I whip out another chart, I think Hume's second point, again, if we're charitably translating this into a Bayesian framework, is that it's not really that surprising to see miracle reports when no miracle has occurred. People lie. People are gullible. People are captivated by the passion of surprise and wonder. People are prone to misapprehending and misinterpreting their experiences. Not to mention that whenever we can check miraculous claims, they are either demonstrably false or the kind of things with plausible naturalistic explanations. Never a regrown limb. Okay, so this is what you've all been waiting for. A final exciting chart. Now, I'm not going to plug actual numbers into this. I just want you to visualize. Notice that even if we grant that the presence of testimonial evidence is very likely given the occurrence of a miracle, that doesn't overcome a sufficiently low prior and still only occupies a very small slice of the probability space. And that's even with me being generous here by insinuating that the presence of testimony given no miracle would be slightly surprising. Part of Hume's whole point is it's not. He would undoubtedly set the likelihood of testimony given no miracle much higher. All of this to say, I think that Craig is demonstrably incorrect to say that Hume only focused on the intrinsic probability or prior probability of miracles. But let's take a break from probability and talk about Craig's low standards for believing in Christianity. Some of you don't know, but he's actually responded directly to me. Tap this video next to me to see some of the drama.